A newborn is lifted from its mother's arms and carried across the courtyard toward a circle of elders. The men are silent. The infant's cries echo against stone. It is stripped, examined, turned over, tiny spine, limbs, chest. A crooked leg, a weak cry, even the wrong complexion could end a life. In Sparta, survival was not a right. It was an assessment. Imagine a society where every heartbeat served the state, where love itself was considered a potential weakness. What would happen to compassion when loyalty to the collective replaced loyalty to one's own child? This was not legend, not allegory. The Spartan system of breeding and inspection was among the earliest recorded attempts at state-directed human selection, a program designed to manufacture perfect soldiers by regulating who could reproduce, which infants could live, and how children were molded thereafter. How far can a civilization go in pursuit of perfection before it erases the humanity it set out to strengthen? Stay to the end and we'll follow Sparta's experiment from the marriage bed to the battlefield, and to its self-inflicted collapse. If you value careful history told hard and true like this video, subscribe to Tale of History and share where you're watching from, because understanding how power shapes humanity connects every one of us. When modern audiences picture Sparta, they often recall the bronze helms of Thermopylae or the crimson cloaks of disciplined hoplites. Yet the Spartan war machine began centuries before that famous stand, within the walls of domestic life. Power in Sparta rested on control not only of land and labor but of reproduction itself. The state's governing elders, the Gerousia and Ephors, treated marriage as a civic assignment. Partnerships were arranged through lineage review, a practice described by Plutarch and Xenophon. Male citizens of fighting age, around 20, were paired not by preference or affection but by pedigree. The magistrates recorded family histories much like stock breeders track bloodlines. The logic was chillingly consistent. If Sparta's defense depended on physical excellence, then private choice could not be trusted to chance. Marriage was not for love but for the breeding of children. Courtship scarcely existed. Once the council selected a match, the ritual that followed blurred the line between ceremony and abduction. The bride's hair was shaved, she was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. The groom, still living in his military barracks, visited her secretly at night, consummated the union in darkness, and departed before dawn. To outsiders this may sound theatrical, even symbolic. To Spartans it served a measurable purpose: avoid emotional attachment. Bonds of passion, they believed, could cloud a man's readiness to die for the polis. The repetition of separation, brief meetings, no domestic routine, ensured that the state remained the only enduring relationship in a warrior's life. Aristotle, writing a century later, criticized the custom as the corruption of natural affection. Yet in Sparta it was doctrine. Spartan women occupy a paradox in ancient history. They were literate, physically trained, and legally able to own land, privileges that astonished other Greeks. But these freedoms were not granted for equality's sake. They were instruments of state policy. The women's athletic regime, described by Xenophon, aimed at producing stronger infants. The songs sung during girls' training praised mothers whose sons died bravely and mocked those whose sons survived through cowardice. Even maternal love was measured by battlefield outcome. Modern scholars such as Sarah Pomeroy and Paul Cartledge emphasize that the Spartan woman's education served biological utility: healthy mothers for durable warriors. In effect, women became the infrastructure of militarism, their autonomy tolerated only so long as it advanced demographic strength. Still, there were contradictions. Because men lived collectively in barracks until age 30, women managed estates and economic affairs. Some became wealthy landowners, challenging the very austerity the state preached. Thus, the policy that began as eugenic control eventually produced unexpected independence among elite women, a tension that would later fracture Spartan unity. A Spartan youth reached adulthood without private decision. His food, clothing, lodging, and peers were assigned. Even conversation was regulated through the laconic ideal: few words, sharp wit, no waste. When told he would marry, he accepted as he accepted every command. Marriage was duty, not emotion. On the wedding night, according to Plutarch, the groom carried off his bride as though in capture, a performance sanctioned by custom. Such ritualized violence mirrored the larger ideology: conquest proved worth, tenderness suggested weakness. The newly paired woman, her head shorn and body clothed in masculine garb, symbolized the merging of opposites into a single civic purpose: the creation of sons who would serve. In the rare daylight meetings permitted afterward, conversation was formal, monitored. Husbands were expected to praise physical vigor, not affection. Intimacy, the emotional kind, was almost treasonous. To love privately was to withdraw allegiance from the collective. Contemporary philosophers outside Sparta found this grotesque. Aristotle argued in the Politics that the city's obsession with military virtue made them brave for one day but foolish for all time. His critique underscored a moral cost visible even to contemporaries. A system optimized for war could not sustain the subtleties of peace. Why did Sparta go this far? Geography and fear. The Spartan homeland, Laconia, contained a vast population of Helots, enslaved Greeks conquered from neighboring Messenia. They outnumbered Spartan citizens by perhaps 10 to 1. The state's survival depended on maintaining dominance over this majority through permanent readiness for revolt. Every citizen had to be a soldier, and every soldier had to be the product of selective hardening. From conception onward, therefore, personal choice was a liability. By eliminating uncertainty in mating and by suppressing affection, the leaders believed they could standardize virtue. The result was a society both extraordinarily stable and perpetually brittle. Stable because obedience was absolute, brittle because individuality was erased. When Plutarch later admired Spartan discipline, he also hinted at unease, a community of men trained to fear only shame, yet compelled by fear of their own slaves. Modern historians see here an early example of what sociologists call biopolitical governance, the management of life itself as a state resource. By the time a Spartan couple had completed their sanctioned union, the individual will had long been subdued. A young man might know his lineage back 5 generations yet remain ignorant of personal desire. A young woman might recite law and poetry yet never choose her partner. Both served a higher design they had been taught to revere as natural order. In this meticulously engineered world, birth was not a beginning, it was an evaluation. The same magistrates who arranged conception would soon decide whether the product of that union deserved to exist. But the most chilling moment arrived 9 months later, at birth. Long before Spartan boys lifted a spear, the state had already lifted control over their parents. Conception itself was a civic act. In every sense, the household was subordinate to the collective. Sparta's dual kings shared authority with a council of elders, the Gerousia, and a group of 5 ephors, magistrates elected annually. These officials oversaw not only law and war but lineage. In their records lay what could be called the first bureaucratic breeding ledger in European history. They tracked families for generations, battlefield distinctions, maternal health, even the fertility history of grandmothers. The goal was stability through selection. When the elders decided a young man of 20 was ready to marry, he received no list of prospects, no ceremony of courtship. His match had already been made in the deliberations of men decades older, guided by the principle attributed to Lycurgus himself, that private life must serve the state's survival. Plutarch, writing centuries later, described a process that would seem mechanical if it were not so intimate. The maidens were given in marriage, he wrote, not for dowry but for strength of body. Property had no role in the union, at least in theory. The dowry system common elsewhere in Greece was replaced by a political one, the contribution of future soldiers. The marriage ritual remained deliberately strange. After selection, the bride's hair was cut short and her head shaved, a gesture of uniformity. The groom, who still ate and slept in the barracks, would carry her off by night. The act mimicked abduction but was in fact a ritualized exchange of ownership, from family to state-sanctioned husband. She would dress in men's clothing, perhaps symbolically erasing difference. Then, after consummation, he returned to the communal quarters before dawn. Sparta, the only Greek city where husbands could be punished for seeing their wives too often. It seems absurd, punished for devotion, but the law served design. Passion and domestic familiarity were viewed as threats to discipline. A warrior who longed for home might hesitate on campaign. A soldier who felt too deeply might falter when ordered to die. The system therefore prescribed distance. Brief encounters, no shared dwelling until age 30, and little conversation about anything but duty. Sparta's obsession with lineage extended to property, though paradoxically, it banned most forms of wealth display. Every citizen's estate, kleros, was originally distributed equally to ensure that no man's sons would inherit advantage unrelated to valor. But equality required monitoring. When deaths in battle reduced the number of heirs, landholding women began to accumulate property through inheritance. By the 4th century BCE, Aristotle observed that women owned 2/5 of Spartan land. That statistic reveals the unintended consequence of strict male discipline. The army's absence made women rich. This wealth, however, was never allowed to translate into independent reproductive choice. Even the most prosperous widow might be reassigned by decree if her bloodline, was judged too valuable to end. Remarriage was not personal, it was demographic policy. One example appears in Plutarch's account of King Anaxandridas II. When his first wife proved barren, the ephors ordered him to take a second wife while keeping the first, an official polygamy justified purely by population need. The king protested, but the magistrates insisted. A monarchy that ruled by divine lineage could not risk extinction through sentiment. Thus, even kings obeyed the principle: fertility over affection, continuity over conscience. A stranger rule still governed couples whose unions produced no offspring. The state sometimes authorized a physically proven warrior to impregnate another man's wife, provided the husband consented. Plutarch likened the arrangement to a stud system. Men lent their wives as farmers lend their seed bulls. The child, regardless of biological father, legally belonged to the household of the husband. It was not adultery, it was civic collaboration. Modern readers recoil, but for the Spartans, reproduction was less about lineage purity and more about utility. If two strong bodies could yield a stronger soldier, then morality was irrelevant. Aristotle condemned the practice as degrading to both sexes, yet it persisted for generations. The logic was so pervasive that even widows could be compelled to bear children by arrangement, ensuring no fertile woman went unused. Spartan law effectively merged reproductive rights with military logistics. It's difficult to imagine privacy in such a world. Every stage of life unfolded under observation. Births, marriages, and deaths were matters of public record, and deviation from the norm attracted reprimand. The result was a population of fewer than 10,000 full citizens, the homoioi, the equals, who were anything but equal in freedom. Boys were inspected for health, men were inspected for valor, women were inspected for fertility. Citizenship was conditional, and that condition was performance. Sparta's remarkable stability, 3 centuries of internal order, rested on the vigilance of these controls. Yet beneath it lay unrelieved anxiety. The entire social system was designed to withstand revolt from the enslaved majority, the Helots. To maintain dominance, the rulers sought to engineer fearlessness at home and terror abroad. The breeding system thus became a moral assembly line: selection, separation, conception, supervision. Each component removed one more element of human unpredictability. Ironically, the mechanism of control produced an outcome that no legislator had intended. As men perished in constant warfare and women inherited estates, economic power shifted toward the very group the laws were meant to constrain. By the late classical period, many women commanded resources rivaling the state itself. This wealth created social tension and opened quiet resistance. Some women arranged private unions outside official oversight. Others manipulated inheritance laws to favor their own kin. Contemporary writers hint that the strict eugenic order was already fraying by the 4th century. The philosopher Xenophon, himself an admirer of Spartan discipline, conceded that the old ways were in decline. The system that once promised perfection was beginning to erode under the weight of its own rigidity. From the vantage of history, Sparta's regulation of conception stands as one of antiquity's starkest examples of the state overriding the private sphere. No law compelled citizens to think; the conditioning achieved that voluntarily. Ideology substituted for enforcement. To question these customs was not only heretical but unthinkable. Spartan education had already removed the vocabulary of dissent. The historian Stephen Hodkinson describes it succinctly: Sparta transformed reproduction into a public duty disguised as private virtue. In that transformation lay the seed of its eventual decline. Once personal conscience has been surrendered entirely to law, adaptation becomes impossible. The Spartan project had achieved its goal: a self-replicating cycle of loyalty. Yet this perfection came with a silent cost. Love became logistical. Desire became regulated. The moment of birth itself would determine whether the entire design succeeded. A child's first breath didn't promise life, it triggered judgment. 9 months after the state-sanctioned marriage, the ideology of Spartan perfection reached its most merciless moment. When a woman gave birth, joy was postponed. The newborn was immediately carried not to its mother's chest but to a panel of elders, the Gerousia, for examination. Plutarch describes the scene with unnerving detachment. Elders inspected each infant, to see if it were sturdy and well made. Those judged weak or malformed were sent to the apothetai, the deposits, an open chasm near Mount Taygetus where they were left, thinking it better for such to die at once than live to be miserable and infirm. In that single act, private affection yielded to civic arithmetic. The mother could not intervene, the father had no voice. The decision of the state was final. The ritual served what Spartans called necessity. Their citizens, perhaps only 8,000 adult males at the height of power, were surrounded by tens of thousands of enslaved helots. Every citizen had to be fit to fight. A single weak link threatened the phalanx, that interlocked wall of shields on which Spartan identity depended. To the Spartan mind, compassion was a luxury only the secure could afford, and Sparta was never secure. A weak child, one proverb claimed, is a crack in the wall. Modern scholars suspect this aphorism crystallized a real policy, the elimination of physical weakness before it consumed resources. Yet even ancient observers recoiled. Aristotle condemned the practice, calling it the natural end of excessive discipline. Philosophers in Athens used it as evidence that Spartan virtue had turned mechanical, courage without conscience. Writers such as Plutarch and Xenophon presented infant selection as law, part of Lycurgus's original constitution. Plutarch claimed that only infants of sound body were allowed to live, while Xenophon described the inspection as routine and unemotional. The process likely took place at a site west of Sparta later identified with a ravine at Mount Taygetus. Roman travelers wrote of seeing bones at the foot of the cliff, a detail that cemented the legend of the apothecary. For centuries, this story dominated Western imagination, Sparta as the city that murdered its weak in the name of strength. Artists painted scenes of elders holding infants aloft before the mountains. Philosophers cited it as the purest form of civic ruthlessness. But the historical question remains, did it truly happen on the scale described, or had Sparta's enemies amplified the cruelty? Excavations around Taygetus and the Eurotas Valley tell a subtler story. Archaeologists have indeed recovered infant bones from a chasm long believed to be the apothecary, but most remains date to the Hellenistic and Roman periods, centuries after classical Sparta's prime. The find included adults and adolescents, suggesting a place of execution or accidental burial, not systematic exposure of newborns. Historians such as Stephen Hodkinson and Nigel Kennell argue that the practice may have been exaggerated, perhaps reserved for rare, visibly deformed births rather than routine selection. Even Plutarch wrote centuries later, relying on oral tradition colored by admiration and fear. Xenophon, an eyewitness to Spartan life, never explicitly mentions infant killing, only state oversight of upbringing. Other scholars maintain that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Infant bones seldom survive, and exposure leaves little archaeological trace. What matters, they suggest, is not frequency but ideology, the belief that the state could determine who deserved to live. Evidence versus legend. How often did it really happen? The truth may be smaller in number but not in meaning. Sparta's myth was as powerful as its law. If you value historical storytelling grounded in evidence, not myth, subscribe to Tale of History. We separate what was said from what was proven. Regardless of frequency, the story of inspection reveals how moral language can be redefined through repetition. By calling the act necessary, Spartans transformed compassion into weakness and cruelty into duty. In the same way, later societies, from Rome to modern regimes, would justify atrocities as efficiency. The blueprint was already there. Eliminate fragility, reward conformity, erase the question of worth. To the mother who gave birth, silence was the price of belonging. To the magistrate who condemned, the act was service. Between them stood an infant whose value was measured not by its heartbeat, but by its potential utility. For those infants judged fit, life did not return to the family. They were entered into a registry and raised under watch. At 7 years old, the state came again, not to kill but to claim. Childhood ended with the same impersonal certainty as birth. If you survived that judgment, the state took you at 7. At 7 years old, a Spartan child ceased to belong to his family. The state claimed him, not symbolically but physically. Officials arrived at the household, inspected the boy's frame, and escorted him to the communal barracks. His mother did not resist. To weep would brand her un-Spartan. From that day the agoge, the upbringing, began. What followed was less an education than an endurance test designed to erase individuality. Every boy wore the same coarse tunic, one garment for all seasons. Bedding consisted of reeds gathered by hand from the Eurotas River, twisted into mats thin enough to make rest another exercise in fortitude. Food was meager by law, enough to live, never enough to be satisfied. Hunger, the instructor said, sharpened instinct. It was also strategy. To feed a child fully was to dull his will, to starve him slightly was to make him cunning. The agoge enforced theft not as vice but as pedagogy. Boys were expected to steal food from kitchens, gardens, or nearby farms without detection. If caught, they were flogged, not for stealing but for being caught. Xenophon confirms the paradox: they punished not the act but the failure. It taught the principle that governed Spartan morality: success defined virtue. What mattered was execution, not ethics. The lesson was internalized early: rules existed to be outwitted so long as the state benefited. Plutarch preserved the most famous anecdote. A boy once stole a young fox and hid it under his cloak. When instructors questioned him, the animal began clawing through his stomach. He remained silent until it killed him. The Spartans honored him for discipline beyond pain. No contemporary evidence corroborates the story. It first appears centuries later. Most historians treat it as legend illustrating the ideal rather than a factual event. But its survival across generations reveals what Spartans wanted believed: that endurance outweighed life itself. Every aspect of the agoge transformed learning into performance. Speech, for instance, was restricted. Boys answered in brief, sharp phrases, laconic replies that mirrored the conciseness of military orders. Instructors would pose questions purely to trap them in hesitation. A pause too long, a word too many invited pain. Aristotle noted that Spartans trained to win with silence. Physical punishment was routine. Beatings were public and ritualized, not expressions of anger but demonstrations of control. Older youths, the irons, were allowed to strike younger ones for errors in posture, tone, or deference. The hierarchy was absolute. To command, one must first learn to suffer. Fear of humiliation became a constant companion. Yet within that cruelty lay social engineering. The state was manufacturing obedience, citizens who would obey orders even when those orders defied instinct. Each year, adolescents faced the altar of Artemis Orthia, goddess of the wilderness. During the festival, cheese was piled on the altar, and boys competed to snatch it while older youths whipped them with leather lashes. The spectacle served as both initiation and public entertainment. Roman tourists later recorded seeing boys collapse or die under the lash, smiling through the agony. Archaeological excavations at the sanctuary have uncovered blood-stained altars and votive offerings shaped as whips and masks, confirming ritualized flogging occurred, though not necessarily to death. Historians now view the accounts of fatal beatings with caution. Ancient writers often exaggerated for moral contrast. Yet the core truth stands: pain was rebranded as purification. To flinch was failure, to endure was virtue. In the economy of Spartan values, suffering became currency. They learned to steal, to lie, to bleed, without emotion. If the past grips you not just for what happened but for what it reveals about power, stay with us. Tale of History brings history stripped of myth, grounded in evidence. Subscribe, share, and keep this channel alive for those who still crave truth over legend. What began as military preparation evolved into psychological conditioning. Every hunger pang, every blow, every public test had a political purpose: to dissolve the self into the collective. Modern scholars describe the agoge as a laboratory of obedience, a system that produced soldiers incapable of rebellion because rebellion required selfhood. Friendships formed under pressure, but affection was constrained. Instructors discouraged empathy, fearing it might soften discipline. Those who endured together became bound by shared pain rather than trust. Even language became a weapon. The brevity of speech trained them to compress thought, to act before reflection. By adulthood they could articulate orders but not moral doubt. By his late teens, the Spartan youth had mastered silence, hunger, and pain. He was fast, obedient, and emotionally barren, the perfect instrument of the state. Yet one final test remained, more secret and more chilling than all before. It would prove whether he could kill not in battle but in peace. The final exam was not a battle line, it was the night. By the time a Spartan youth reached adulthood, he had been starved, beaten, and hardened. But his real initiation, what the state called the krypteia, was not about endurance. It was about obedience in its most absolute form, the ability to kill without command, without remorse, and without recognition. Plato called it a kind of secret police, while Aristotle described it more bluntly: a system by which the state kept the helots in fear. The helots, the enslaved population of Messenia and Laconia, outnumbered the Spartans perhaps 7-1. Every reform of Lycurgus, every rule of discipline, existed because of them. Without control there would be revolt. So each year the ephors, the 5 supreme magistrates, declared war not on Persia, not on Athens but on their own serfs. This legal fiction allowed the killing of helots without impiety. Young men chosen for the krypteia were then sent into the countryside, armed with daggers, to eliminate the boldest and strongest of the slaves. To outsiders it seemed madness. To Spartans it was maintenance. The Helots tilled the fields, raised the crops, and sustained the warrior class that scorned manual labor. If they rebelled, the Spartan way of life would collapse overnight. Therefore terror was not crime, it was strategy. The Cryptia made every Helot live under the suspicion that death could come at any moment, from any shadow. Aristotle notes that even small infractions could trigger mass killings. One revolt was answered by the execution of 2,000 Helots who had been publicly praised for loyalty, then quietly murdered soon after. The message was unmistakable: loyalty itself could be fatal if it looked like pride. Night. No moon. The reeds whisper against the riverbank. A youth barefoot moves through the fields. His dagger is wrapped in linen to muffle reflection. He has eaten nothing for a day by design. From the barracks he has been sent alone with only the order, observe and act. He watches a Helot lighting a torch near a granary. The man hums as he works. The boy's training returns. No empathy, no hesitation. He steps forward. The torch falls. Silence. He will return to Sparta at dawn and speak of nothing. If asked, he will answer as he was taught, briefly, clearly, without visible thought. Did this system truly exist in the continuous, state-sanctioned form described by later writers? Some historians argue yes, pointing to consistency in accounts by Aristotle, Plato, and Plutarch, all describing the Cryptia as organized terror. Others see exaggeration, perhaps an elite reconnaissance corps or initiation ritual later misinterpreted by outsiders. Xenophon, who admired Spartan customs, makes no mention of killings, which raises doubts. Archaeological corroboration is elusive. No mass graves can be confidently tied to the Cryptia. But ancient testimonies agree that Helots were routinely massacred following revolts, especially after the great Messenian uprisings of the 7th and 5th centuries BCE. Whether the Cryptia was permanent or periodic, its psychological function is undeniable. It preserved the balance of terror on which Spartan equality rested. Behind the statistics lies the moral corrosion. Sparta had built a society in which virtue meant compliance and security meant fear. The citizens called themselves the equals, yet their equality required thousands to live in bondage and dread. To kill a slave was not murder, it was maintenance. To question it was to question the state. The young killers of the Cryptia returned to their units celebrated, not haunted. They had proven they could obey without conscience. This was the hidden foundation of the Spartan miracle. Peace purchased through perpetual violence. A community at war with itself. A society built on fear cannot last forever. If you find this hard to imagine, remember, every civilization has justified cruelty in the name of order. To keep this channel bringing careful history to more viewers, grounded in evidence, not spectacle, subscribe to Tale of History. Because only when we face what power truly costs can we understand how it collapses. For nearly 3 centuries this system worked. The Helots stayed subdued, the army invincible, the citizens convinced of divine favor. Yet beneath the calm, numbers were shrinking, allies turning, and ideals hollowing. The structure that appeared eternal was already rotting. Sparta had built perfection on fear. But fear, like hunger, always returns. All of this worked until it didn't. For centuries, Sparta seemed timeless, a state that had mastered both body and mind. But perfection has a price, and the bill always arrives late. By the 4th century BCE, the arithmetic no longer worked. Sparta's population of full citizens, the homoioi, the equals, had fallen from about 8,000 to barely 700 adult males. Every war, every infanticide, every purge of the Cryptia had drained the source it meant to preserve. The system that demanded purity became a trap. Each death narrowed the pool of those fit to reproduce, and property rules prevented redistribution. Land accumulated in fewer hands, and equality, the one ideal the Spartans claimed, died first. Aristotle, visiting in the 4th century, described a society rich in women, poor in men. Military discipline remained, but the soldiers it required no longer existed. The reckoning came in 371 BCE, on a plain near Leuctra in Boeotia. For the first time in living memory, Sparta marched against an enemy that had studied its methods and found their weaknesses. The Theban general Epaminondas abandoned the symmetrical formations that had dominated Greek warfare. Instead of matching Sparta line for line, he concentrated his best troops on a single wing, arranged 50 men deep, and aimed directly at the Spartan king's position. The Spartans refused to adapt. Their law forbade it. Tactics were not a choice but a creed. When the Theban phalanx struck, the Spartan line shattered. In less than an hour, 400 citizens, 1/5 of Sparta's adult male elite, lay dead. No victory could replace them, No birth rate could recover what the state had destroyed through control. Leuctra was not merely a defeat of arms, it was the collapse of an algorithm. The machine that had once produced invincibility could not handle deviation. Perfection had made it brittle. Sparta survived politically, but spiritually it was finished. Its army lingered, its kings continued, but its citizens dwindled into memory. The population problem grew irreversible. By the 3rd century BCE, fewer than 100 true homoioi remained. They opened their ranks to outsiders, freed helots to serve as mercenaries, even minted coins despite centuries of bans. Every measure once forbidden became necessary for survival. Wealth, which the law had once despised, now ruled the city. Families hoarded estates, women controlled inheritance, and new elites replaced the old soldiers. By the time the Romans arrived, Sparta was no longer feared but staged. Its festivals of whipping and discipline had become tourist spectacles, performances for foreign visitors who came to watch what had once been real. The transformation was complete. The world's most disciplined state reduced to reenacting its own legend. It would be easy to dismiss Sparta as ancient cruelty, alien and long gone. But the temptation it embodied, the belief that society can be perfected by controlling human variation, has reappeared across ages. In the early 20th century, eugenic movements in Europe and America borrowed language uncannily close to Spartan ideals: fitness, purity, improvement of stock. Decades later, totalitarian regimes turned the rhetoric of discipline into mass surveillance and ideological grooming. This is not equivalence. Sparta was a small agrarian city-state. The modern world wields powers of scale it could never imagine. But the pattern, sacrifice of humanity for efficiency, of conscience for control, remains constant. The historian Paul Cartledge calls Sparta a mirror for the West's recurring dream of perfection. Each time that dream ends the same way, in rigidity, repression, and ruin. The question posed in the beginning was simple: what did a state give in exchange for perfect warriors? The answer is everything that makes warriors human. Sparta traded tenderness for training, conscience for cohesion, and diversity for discipline. It produced soldiers who never broke rank, but also citizens who could not change course. Its strength was absolute, its adaptability zero. When perfection became identity, failure became destiny. The homoioi disappeared not through invasion but through arithmetic and ideology, death by design. Their last descendant died in anonymity, their city lived on only as caution. The ruins of Sparta lie quiet now, olive trees growing between the stones. No marble citadel, no imperial monuments, just fields and faint outlines of training grounds where boys once learned to steal and suffer. Yet the echo of their choices endures. Every society that seeks to engineer purity, racial, moral, ideological, walks that same narrow ridge between order and annihilation. History does not repeat, but it warns. Sparta's perfection did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it succeeded too well. The price of perfection is the death of change. If you believe history deserves to be told with precision, without myth or apology, support the work. Like, share, and subscribe to Tale of History so we can keep building the archive of the world as it really was. Sparta mastered the art of control, and vanished beneath its own design.